Hello, good evening and a very warm welcome to this Friday night edition of the Watchdog. I'm Peter Ndora, standing in for Vuyon Mvoko tonight. Now, on the programme today, we'll be focusing on issues of climate as world leaders and industry experts are gathering in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for climate change conference COP27. And remember, you can be part of the show via Twitter. Our handle is @TheWatchdog, SABC, Peter Ndoro, and @Watchdog SABC. We'd love to hear from you. All of that coming up and much, much more as well. US President Joe Biden hopes to rekindle the ambition to combat climate change at COP27. That's despite the depressing distractions of war in Ukraine and rampant global inflation. Biden is in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, joining several leaders who are looking at ways to deal with climate change.
The US is the world's second largest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and is under enormous pressure to reduce its emissions. President Joe Biden wants to remind countries to stay focused on the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. He says his schedule will be extremely busy.
I don't think the conflict will be resolved with Russia and Ukraine until Putin gets out of Ukraine. Anyway, I'm heading down to, first of all, going to Cairo for the environmental effort.
The World Bank has made it clear that member states must put concerted efforts in tackling climate change.
We have massive climate change financing now, $32 billion. Of that, half is adaptation, which is, and the rest of the world, not much at all. And so as we go forward, we need to build those efforts, but also bring more donors into adaptation and the private sector into adaptation. They bear a responsibility, and I think we'll need to really be stepping up.
Meanwhile, China has called on developed countries to fulfill their commitment made in 2009 at the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference about providing $100 billion a year to help developing countries.
As for the climate finance, the developed countries promised in Copenhagen in 2009 to mobilize $100 billion a year to developing nations. But they have failed to honor this commitment. In all, they owe more than $260 billion in this regard.
As the climate change talks continue in Egypt, African countries say they are tired of empty promises, and they want the developed nations not to shy away from their commitments. Kylie Kumalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
US President Joe Biden has announced a funding of $150 million for climate adaptation in Africa. Biden has also called on developed countries to put more funds forward to help developing nations deal with climate change. He says the United States will meet its emissions target by 2030. Speaking at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, President Biden said that there was no reason not to finance clean energy in developing countries. He raised concerns about how climate change affects food security globally.
We're racing forward to do our part to avert the climate hell that the UN Secretary General so passionately warned about earlier this week. We're not ignoring harbingers that are already here. It's true, so many disasters. Climate crisis is hitting hardest those countries and communities that have the fewest resources to respond and to recover. And that's why last year I committed to work with our Congress to quadruple U.S. support to climate finance and provide $11 billion annually by 2024, including $3 billion for adaptation. That's why the Fund Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, PREPARE we call it, to help more than 500 million people in developing countries respond to climate change. We're already requested more than $2 billion for the Prepare this year. I'm going to fight to see that this and our other climate objectives are fully funded. Today, as a down payment, we're announcing more than $150 million in initiatives that specifically support Prepare's adaptation efforts throughout Africa, including Adaptation in Africa, effort that Egypt and the United States launched together in June. This includes support for expanding early warning systems to help cover Africa, broadening access to climate finance, providing disaster risk protection, strengthening food security, mobilizing the private sector, and supporting new training center in Egypt to accelerate adaptation across the efforts all across the continent.
Now, South Africa has secured concessional loans from France and Germany, valued at around 10.7 billion. It's been an eventful few days for the nation at COP27, having officially handed over its Just Transition Investment Plan to International Partners Group. Now, the agreements are part of the initial $8.5 billion, 153 billion rand, that was pledged to South Africa by the International Partners Group, the IPG. And that's the UK, US, France, Germany and the EU. Well, joining us for a little bit more on this is Dr. Dick Forsland, who's a senior economist with the Alternative Information and Development Centre, and Gilad Isaacs from the Institute for Economic Justice. To both of you, a very good evening. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks very much.
Okay, let me start with you, Dr. Forsland. Just give us your thoughts. On the face of it, you know, as lay people, we hear that we've been given a loan to help us with the just transition, and this seems like a good thing, is it?
No, it's not a good thing that the South African government is continuing to take all these foreign loans. I mean, this is the third loan in foreign currency during this year. And as you don't know what will happen with the exchange rate in the future, now it's down again some 50 cents. These loans, even if some of the loans will not be kind of at the normal market interest rate, you don't know what they will be, what they will cost if the value of the rand decreases further. And as you might know, only some 3-4% of this is so-called grant funding. And the second thing is that even if you have a concessionary loan, I mean, the lower the interest rate will be, I mean, we predict, or we are scared that the harsher will be the conditions. And I mean, the main condition that these lenders are pushing, that is privatization, especially of the energy provision. But I'm sure also when it comes to the German loan, they want to export electrical cars here to South Africa. They don't want South Africa, I mean, South Africa should have their own local industry of, for example, electrical cars. That is far down on their agenda. They want to pave way for their private sector, for their private corporations. So I mean, I think we are selling out our local industry, and we are just with the old World Bank loan in January of $750 million. We are abiding by all these conditions, and conditions with the World Bank is to push the austerity program, which you know is creating so much trouble now.
All right, Gilad, do you agree with that? What's your take? I mean, is this just economics?
So I think that the issue which Dick raises first of grants versus loans is an important one. And it's important in the context of climate change, right? Where actually what we have is a historic use of fossil fuels by the developed world, and really a responsibility to ensure that we can have a sustainable life. and that should be the responsibility of those who have emitted most. I think more specifically here is that these loans create a particular architecture and actually lock us into a particular system of energy provision. That is a system which will increase energy prices. The financing plan, which we see now, it pushes heavily on the use of independent power producers, which Eskom notes is a key reason for the increased electricity rates. And those IPPs receive a price lock-in and a demand guarantee where the electricity, both in its price and in the amount which Eskom will be purchasing from those IPPs, is agreed in advance, even if, as we know happens, the cost of renewable energy falls. So the risk is borne by the public sector, and these agreements drive so-called cost-reflective tariffs, which is really is cost plus profit plus interest rate for those IPPs. It also locks us into a number of other energy modalities. In particular, there is almost no financing here for the localization of the renewable energy value chain and its manufacturing in particular. So the financing is going towards the de-risking, the enticement of private sector investment in IPPs, but the actual employment opportunities in this sector are in the manufacturing of the renewable energy equipment, and only about 0.4% of this financing package is geared towards that. And finally, there's absolutely no financing for workers here. There's going to be significant job loss in the coal value chain. And there's no provision for social security or other type of support for workers.
All right, let me come back to you, Dr. Forslund. And one of the things I know that you're concerned about is that, and you use the word secret deals, that they weren't really transparent. Why is this an issue? I mean, isn't government working in our best interest?
Governments are not always working in our best interest, and number one, they are always working under pressure. And I mean, if they are only under the pressure of the northern governments in this, I mean, civil society, trade unions, affected community representatives and so on, they represent the opposite pressure, of course. So when the government want to get rid of the pressure from South African citizens and from the public debate in South Africa, then we should be very suspicious, I think, because it is only by sort of putting pressure on our negotiators that there will be some kind of deals that resemble something that is good for the broad population in the country and for a just transition. How can a just energy transition take place without the people having a say? I mean, it's a contradiction in terms. And all this discussion about the $8.5 billion that was set out in the Glasgow last year, after that it's been completely silent. And to our information, even the Presidential Climate Commission, they are not sort of particularly informed of what is going on. It's been going on behind closed doors. Why? Well, because some of the members in the Climate Commission, they represent civil society organizations, and the government doesn't want any leaks. And when the government doesn't want any leaks, why? Well, it's because they are bound to make concessions, which they know would be criticized. So that is why we need transparency. We need transparency in order to influence our own politicians and our own negotiators. I mean, it's a rule in every negotiation that you want to know what is happening there. So yeah, that's basically my take on that.
All right, Gilad, in the end, you know, I'm Jabu Sitole, I live in Soweto. All I'm worried about is getting a job. And I'm watching all of this play out. How closer am I getting to getting a job, or is this something that is going to affect me but not help me?
So we would argue that this is not moving us forward. Firstly, it's not moving us towards a provision of energy at a lower cost, which will impact on every business, every self-employed person, and so on. It's also not moving us towards the utilization of this moment of the expansion of renewable energy to actually grow renewable energy sectors in South Africa. The installation and maintaining of the generation plants, the wind towers, the solar fields, and so on, that's not very labor intensive. The labor intensity is in the manufacturing of those items, which are then installed. And so what we need to be thinking about in South Africa is how do we structure financing arrangements in a way which, yes, supports the implementation of renewable energy generation, but at the same time drives significant funding towards the localization of the manufacturing and for export across Africa of that technology. And at the same time, how do we make provisions for either the reskilling, retrenchment, support of those in coal sectors who will be affected. If I might just add on this issue of secrecy, and you know, governments pushed back, and the negotiators against us, because we've been saying this for the last like 2 or 3 months, and they claiming, including at COP in public forums, that this deal represents an example of how one does these things right. And one reason is they tout this extensive consultation. Well, we've actually been in those so-called consultations, and there's been very few with labor, youth, civil society, and in those consultations, and most groups they've met only once. We asked for the actual information. What's in these plans? What kind of conditions, or what types of lending, etc., etc. And every single answer was, oh no, that's market sensitive, that's not finalized. So after 2 hours or 3 hours of this, one leaves feeling that this is a complete sham, that we're here in a consultation where really everything which we ask, we're being answered with, well, we're here to consult, but we can't really tell you anything.
All right, okay, so not the best way to do things, it sounds like. Dr. Forsland, look, we have to transition to a low-carbon economy. Are you saying that there's a better way of doing this and a better place to source the funding?
Yes, and we have been saying this for a long time. And one obvious fund that we have been pointing to is the state pension fund GPF, which, as you know, is managed by this public investment corporation. Here you have a fund which now is about 2.3 trillion rand, which the fund basically doesn't need. But I mean, the Johannesburg stock market, maybe they need this money, but as for the fund itself, it's running with about 50 billion rand surplus every year after paying pension and benefits. And I mean the GPF, the state pension fund, should have the same investment policy as the UIF, the unemployment insurance fund. They only put 25% of their funds in risk investment in shares, and the rest is held in bonds. But for the GPF, it's over 50%, and I mean that is also why. And I spoke to a representative of Fiducia the other day. That is why now the pensions have been cut for the members who have retired from state employment. It has been cut now this month by up to 4,000 rand per month because of the legislation that is surrounding the state pension fund, which is not at all necessary. So this is really, it's an anomaly that the Development Bank of Southern Africa and the GPF holds 25% of the Eskom's debt. So that basically Eskom is bleeding money to the public sector itself, and it's doing it for no good reason. So there is this obvious alternative to fund. You can mop up, or you can find funding domestically and in Africa for this fund. You don't need to run to the finance industry, who is kind of like cooperating with the government in United States, Germany, and France, and so on. And it just kind of makes us more and more dependent or subdued, if you like, under their privatization policy, and pay where for their industry and not for the South African industry. So, I mean, the GPF should start to act in a much more social way, and it will not hurt the pensions and the benefit at all. And when you bring up this with the Treasury, as the midterm budget now, like 2 weeks ago, they just say that, no, we have to tread carefully, this is a sensitive issue. Yeah, but this has been discussed now for 4 years, and it's time to realize that there are funds in the possession of the government. I mean, Godongwana is the chair of the GPF, as far as I know.
All right, so Gillard, you talked about us being locked in, and of course when you borrow money from abroad and you don't know what the repayment terms are, and then of course that thorny issue of a fluctuating currency, what could be the possible consequences for us with these loans that we're getting?
Yeah, I mean, any loan carries risk, and in particular those which are in foreign currency. It's not clear yet if those loans have set interest rates. Some of the loans in COVID from the new development bank and elsewhere had floating interest rate loans tied to what is called LIBOR, the London interbank rate. So both from a currency and from an interest rate point of view, there's a lot more information which we need here. But I think, in terms of being locked in, it's locked in not only to a particular loan deal, and loans per se aren't a problem, right? It's about what goes with those. But these loans and the financing plan is locking us into a particular approach to how energy is provided here. And that approach essentially says that it is the role of the public sector to try and de-risk private sector investment. We use public funds to try and encourage private sector investors, and we as the fiscus absorb that risk, whether that is of a default or of a lack of demand and so on. And that essentially gives these providers their own form of monopoly. And so we are locking ourselves into an approach which says that we will have an energy system which is about the state and ESCOM bearing financial risk, whilst the private sector, both through the generation of the electricity and actually from the on-selling of securities in financial markets, will be reaping the gain of that.
All right, so perhaps a final word from you, Dr. Forsland. In your statement, you talk about the Just Energy Transition Partnerships and Glasgow deal just as being a means to advance the increased privatization of South Africa's energy sector. And you say that we're surrendering the country's energy sovereignty to the dictates of the market. Are we selling our assets to the highest bidder? And is it necessarily bad to privatize some of these SOEs? Because we've shown that we're not very good at running them.
Well, I don't know who you mean by we. I mean, you have certainly not been a part of running them, and not Gillard and not myself. So I mean, there's a structural problem here when it comes to, I mean, nobody can answer the question how you can provide for-profit electricity to all South African if you have these poverty rates in South Africa. You have to subsidize electricity to the main part of the population in South Africa, and the private sector will not do that. So I'm sorry, the approach must be to both fix and finance ESCOM. You have to drive out the corruption from ESCOM, and you have to lift the big yoke of expensive loans that ESCOM is paying for now. And as I pointed out, I mean 1/5 of these loans are paid to the public sector itself, and that's unreasonable. And there you can have the concessionary lending, which is in the interest of the South Africans, and not for external claimants on the country. I mean, these funds, the DBSA and the PIC through the State Pension Fund through the PIC, they can put demands on ESCOM to do this or that, not least to root out corruption and looting from the power stations. But I mean, the more we know that the corruption game also is a private-public partnership. That is what the Zondo Commission have taught us. And we know also that one thing that will always remain for a foreseeable future in the hands of ESCOM, that are the coal power stations. They will for 10, 15, 20 years, depending on how fast the transition to the low fossil fuel progress in the country, they will remain under the control of ESCOM. And then you can't have a situation where ESCOM, the public utility, is deprived of all the secure revenue to finance and maintain the grid and these failing coal power plants. So I'm sorry, but the public sector has to lead the energy transition. And we know, and I say it now for the third time in such an interview, the private sector will only save us from the climate crisis if it is to the right price. And I mean, that is also why all this negotiation has been so secret. We can't have it like this. It must be a public sector led transition if it should be just, and indeed, even if the transition should take place at all. That's my definite my definite opinion about this. The private sector will not save us from this crisis, which is getting worse and worse. I mean, listen to the scientists in Egypt now, what they are telling us.
All right, so I wish we could talk a little bit longer on this, but we've run out of time. So to both of you, Dr. Dick Forslund, Senior Economist, Alternative Information and Development Centre, and Gilad Isaacs, Director at the Institute for Economic Justice. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, gentlemen. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and don't forget you can send us your thoughts and views on any of the issues that we are discussing here today, particularly climate change and also all this money that's being borrowed in our name, and also what the world leaders, industrial experts are saying that are attending the COP27 conference, which is currently underway in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Stay with us. Miriam Makeba after the break. Welcome back. You're watching The Watchdog. Now, something completely different, literally. Now, this week on Wednesday, South Africa and the world over acknowledge and recognize the 14th year commemoration of the passing of humanitarian and musical icon Mama Miriam Makeba. She would have been 90 this year. Dr. Miriam Makeba sadly passed away on the 9th of November in 2008. Well, joining us to discuss her legacy and also, I guess, the legacy of iconic musicians such as her, we're now joined by Lindelani Makeba Lee, who's a musician, producer himself, but also a trustee at the Miriam Makeba Foundation. And we're also joined by Vusi Leo, who's the CEO, President of the South African Music Industry Council. To both of you, a very good evening and welcome. Thanks for joining us. Good evening. Thank you for having us. All right, let me start with you, Lindelani. I suppose, you know, she belonged to the world, literally, but every year at this time, as a family, it is very, very personal. And I just wonder what comes to mind for the family as you remember Mama Miriam.
Well, it's a mix of emotions, you know. There's a lot of nostalgia, a lot of happiness when we think about those moments that were. But at the same time, it's very sad, naturally. She was an icon, she was a mother to everybody, but she was our grandmother. And it was very personal in that sense. But more than that, it is very heartwarming to always see year after year just how much of an impact she left in people's lives and how much she still means to this day. And that always leaves us with a very, very warm feeling inside.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to her. Luckily, got to interview her a few months before she passed, and a remarkable woman. But we'll talk a little bit more about her. Vusi, as someone who's a patron, a custodian of the music industry in South Africa in a form, when icons such as this pass, what should we be doing at a time like this, remembering their life?
Sorry, Peter, I missed you there. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
All right. I'm just saying that for someone like Miriam Makeba, who contributed so much to the music industry, What should we be doing in the modern time to remember and preserve her legacy?
You know, there's so much. Mama Miriam did so much for us in the music industry, but also as a country. I mean, we can't forget instances, for example, the one when she was at the United Nations, you know, risking her life and all, because unfortunately, partly out of that, she was also banned, you know, from coming back into the country. But that's how much she has done for us as South Africans and as the music industry. So we, you know, I must say, Peter, as well, that we thank the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, you know, for being able to, or assisting the family to get back the hands of the family, because partly the disputes that were there have also robbed us of time, both as a country and as the music industry, to celebrate Mama Miriam Makeba accordingly. Because, I mean, besides that, there's the Makeba Center for Girls, which is one of the huge projects that Mama Miriam left for us. I mean, we're supposed to be having even institutions that are named under Mama Miriam, but we believe that going forward, we'll be able to deliver projects and celebrations that will keep the memory of Mama Miriam going on in this country forever.
All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that aspect. I want to chat a little bit about her life with you, Lindelani. So a lot of people here in South Africa perhaps would not understand, if you didn't live in exile, just how difficult it was. Even though she was a prominent musician, exile life wasn't easy, and particularly when she traveled on the continent as well.
This is very true. Fortunately and unfortunately, she was able to see much of the world. So that comes with many of the affluence that you would associate with travel, and unfortunately many of the tragedy that comes with it as well. I would say she had the opportunity to see subjugation in so many different ways and in its worst forms. I mean, much of her life was spent in two countries that essentially perfected the system of human subjugation. Namely being South Africa, apartheid South Africa at the time, and what was, I guess, Jim Crow America. And I think essentially what that did to her is, ironically, it made her a lot more intensely focused towards some sort of positive change. It gave her a lot more attention towards the human experience, and I think that's what so many people identify with. Is that when you listen to her speak, when you listen to her sing, when you watch her live her life, you can see how much reverence and respect she had for human life itself. And that comes out in everything that she was, as a musician, as a humanitarian, an activist, and the mother that we all kept very close to our hearts.
Yeah. Vusi, I guess also, you know, when I spoke to her, I got the sense that she tends to understate her icon status and how great she was. She just loved to sing, and she inspired a lot of singers that came after her. Tell us a little bit about that, because that really is part of her legacy, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's more of you know, people who put other people first, you know. They never kind of think about themselves, and Mama Miriam showed largely that you know, through her sacrifices, you know, that she was not really, she was selfless, and so she was not really more about herself and maybe expecting to be praised, but I believe also maybe she saw herself as a freedom fighter, and as a freedom fighter, you are more about your country and your people before it's about yourself.
All right. You've mentioned the freedom fighter aspect because she was an activist, and one of the iconic moments was when she, at a very young age, was at the United Nations delivering that speech in 1963. Let's go back to that time and see a very young Miriam Makeba with so much responsibility on her shoulders at that time.
Every time we tried to better the situation, the Verwoerd government went further to make South Africa a nightmare to the Africans through police brutality and government terrorism. The story of the shootings at Sharpeville is well known throughout the world. Indeed, all men and women of goodwill all over the world raised their voices in anger on that occasion, but all these protests just fell on deaf ears. Since Sharpeville, many terrible things have occurred in my country. Our political parties were declared illegal, and the leaders were forced to go underground or go into exile to continue the fight from outside and appeal for support from the world. However, since the South African freedom fighters started making representation to the United Nations for the removal of the Verwoerd government and the restoration of power to those to whom it belongs, we have received nothing more than lip service. I have already stated that you and the committee know that the political situation in my country is tense and is even growing more tense. This, therefore, does not leave us with any option but to ask the United Nations to take positive action against the South African government.
All right, Miriam Makeba taking us back to 1963 at a time of great turmoil in South Africa, and she could not have known then that actually that was the moment that she realized that she probably will not be able to go home for a very, very long time. Did she ever talk to you about that moment? Because I think I got a sense that she didn't set out to be a leader, but actually she found herself, because of who she was, being a leader in activism.
Well, she did speak a lot about her time outside during exile, and I don't think she really framed it in the really unfortunate circumstance it really was under. To her, she kind of made that a part of her story, a part of her legend, if you will, which it very much was. And I think more often than not, she found herself faced with different challenges depending on where she went to. But the one thing that always remained the same was, once again, her reverence towards people. Whether it was during her time in Liberia when there was a food shortage and she would have to drive hundreds and if not thousands of kilometers to get food and come back, and run through war-torn cities to ensure that people who were essentially strangers to her could eat, whether it was when she took the initiative to create the Miriam Makeba Center for Girls when nobody had asked for this, nobody had mentioned this as a necessity long before many other popular names began doing something of a similar vein. She just saw this as her responsibility because she was, for whatever reason, blessed with what she saw as great opportunities, and those were not just for her. Those were for as many people as she could impact and affect. And that's part of what all of us were drawn to, you know. She really was Mama Africa. She was a mother to not only those that came from her, but those who were around her. Anyone who essentially was in need, she was always there. And I think that's something today we need to focus on, not only with people like herself, but all of our heroes and heroines of yesterday and yesteryear. We can't just let them die away and their memories along with that. It's important for us to speak about these things, to study these things, and to replicate them, perhaps even better them in some ways. But we cannot forget.
Vusi, I want to come to you. So, Mama Miriam, I got a sense, again, when I spoke to her, that there's this thing that she was well recognized and revered around the world, but sadly at home, she probably didn't get what she deserved here. And that probably is true for so many of our icons. What can we do to change that? You know, we'll have a great funeral and then that's it. And their families, sadly, are left behind often with nothing to hold on to.
Yeah, I think partly I must start maybe with our government and say that our government really needs to do more, especially in respecting the role that the artists have played and that are playing in our communities. And because, I mean, we cannot even start celebrating our freedom when we have not done the right things with our own icons like Mama Miriam and Mama Letambuli and the others. So we really, I think, need to get our government, because by now we're supposed to be even having, like statues and stuff like that are celebrating and keeping the legacy and the history of our icons like Mama Miriam. So which the part of the government's role is that from a financial point, but also for us as the industry, we need to, and which is part of what the Miriam Makeba Foundation and Mr. Khoda are doing, you know, where by basically organizing through music workshops and all of that. But I still feel that even as the president of SAMIC and as SAMIC, that what Mama Miriam fought for, especially even for musicians, we have failed her, or we are failing her currently, and we need to change the music industry. The artists cannot be still going through the kind of problems that our artists in the 80s and 60s and 70s went through. So there's a lot of work that we all have to come together, including our media. I mean, it's sad, I'll be straight with this and say, SABC is one of the biggest culprits. I mean, there was more airplay of our South African music under apartheid compared to today. I mean, we have Metro FM as an example that spends the whole Sunday playing American music when we have so much a catalog of music by Mama Miriam Makeba and a number of her peers that is not played. And our kids cannot have any reflection to a certain extent on South African music, so that whatever that they are also creating as part of the future has the basis of its roots on our own music, that part of the people who have inspired it being the likes of Mama Miriam.
Lindelani, I know that the entire time that Mama Miriam was out in exile, she always longed to come home and free her people. It came, but when she came back, she felt, yes, we've got independence, but there's still so much work to be done. And I know that one of the things was the Girl Center that you spoke about. What would she have liked to have seen happen for the musicians around her?
I think more than anything, Mama Makeba was about empowerment. Whether we were speaking about young ladies, or whether we were speaking about the youth, or whether we were speaking about other musicians. I think more than anything, she wanted to ensure that people could enter into an environment, learn about it, and find a way to place themselves best for their opportunities as well. I think what she would want to see today is, firstly, musicians owning themselves and their identity, musically and creatively. It's very, very important. She always used to say, in order for us to know where we're going, we have to know where we come from. And that's how we understand how we got here. And I think she embodied that not only in her life, but also through her work and her art as well. But she would also want us as musicians to use our platforms for things bigger than ourselves, because essentially that is the grandest and ultimate purpose of music and art as a whole. It's to affect change on society and give us a reason to think, to reflect on who we are, and where we should be. But beyond that, beyond the responsibilities that all of us as artists hold to society, I think she's also very strong on the responsibility society holds to artists as well. And I think right now we should be paying attention to the fact that there are challenges going on for many musicians that should have been addressed long ago. I do think that this is not any one individual or entity or company's responsibility. I think this is something that we have to approach collectively, like most grand challenges in life. But it is very clear that there are many, many things we have to pay attention to. And without getting too deep into that direction, I think what we can do is focus on what's in our hands right now. What we can do today is we can affect a better change, if not through our art and through our music, through our own actions. We can spend a little bit more time focusing on our neighbors, focusing on our communities, attending different venues and homes like the Makeba Center as well, all throughout our country. I think she would want to see that not only for the musicians, but for the people themselves.
Lindelani Makeba Lee, thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us an opportunity to talk about Mama Miriam, and for your family, giving us to her for a period of time in our history and the legacy she's left behind. Thank you so much indeed. And to you, Vusi, thank you very much indeed, my brother. And I think that you have huge work to do. And I will pick up the phone for you here at the SABC for us to do a little better. Thanks so much for bringing that up, and thanks for your time.
Hey, just to also mention that there's going to be a memorial lecture on the 10th of December. But I think people can check our social media and the Miriam Makeba Foundation social media pages and website for more information. And lastly, I know it's time, but I'd like to quote one of the most significant, I think, statements that were made by Mama Miriam when she said, "I kept my culture, I kept the music of my roots. Through my music, I became this voice and image of Africa and the people without even realizing." So that summarizes, I think, who Mama Miriam is.
Fantastic. Thank you so much indeed. And that's where we'll end the Watchdog for today. Thanks so much indeed for tuning in. And we'll see you again next week. We'll be back on Monday. Bye-bye.